I'm David Lombardo, and you're listening to WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. For years, Democrats in New York's state legislature have been exploring how to use advanced technology to address gun crimes, whether it's a long-stalled effort to require a unique stamp on bullets fired from specific guns, to legislation approved along partisan lines during the 2026 legislative session that would require the Hochul administration study the viability of, quote, smart guns in order to ensure only an authorized user is firing a weapon. For more on this legislation and the use of technological breakthroughs for the purpose of gun control, we're checking in with Kerri Raissian, Executive Director of Yale School of Public Health's Firearm Injury Prevention Team and a member of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Thanks for making the time, Kerri.
Hi, thanks for having me, David.
Well, the legislation that I mentioned at the top would require the State Division of Criminal Justice Services to explore the technological viability of personalized handguns, which would be, quote, reasonably resistant to being fired except when activated by the lawful owner or other users authorized by the lawful owner. I've seen this technology in action in movies like Skyfall and The Fifth Element, but is this something that exists in a practical way in 2026?
So thanks for the question. It's, I think it's a promising emerging technology. I wouldn't say that we have, solved the technological advancement here. I'd say we're in the early phases of figuring out exactly how to make firearms smart that might be new to the market. And then, of course, there's also how do we make firearms that are already in existence, like the stock, which are, hundreds of millions of firearms, smart as well. So we have a long way to go in figuring out both how to do new firearms and existing firearms and to make them smart.
Well, yeah, I want to get into the existing guns, which, as you pointed out, is a boatload of guns across the country. But in terms of how this might be utilized for new weapons moving forward, is this something that firearm makers are actively studying? Is it something that gun control advocates are the ones studying? Who's doing this type of research?
So research, I would say probably, everybody's researching new things, but the extent to which we know about the research is, not as robust, right? If a firearm industry manufacturer is doing industry research, that's going to be proprietary and not necessarily something that the general public knows about. But I'm confident that those things are happening. I think, yes, advocates and those that just sort of want less firearm injury, like myself, are studying this. I also think, another sort of rail of where we're seeing this sort of safe technology, biometrics, et cetera, is in the area of secure storage. We're seeing a lot of emergence of biometrics happening there. And industry is certainly studying that, as well as, those interested in firearm injury prevention. So that's another tier of this. To your question about whether or not this is viable for the market, right now we have sort of smaller manufacturers interested in introducing this technology. We haven't really seen it coming, at least not in a market way, from our large manufacturers, your Glocks, your SIGs, et cetera, that have a large amount of the market share. We're seeing this from smaller manufacturers, which does a couple of things. One, it's not as accessible to people. You don't see the smaller firearms dealers on the shelves of the stores in the way you see the big names, right? That's true with any product. Number two, it means that the cost is going to be still quite high, right? Because in a free market, the more people that are introducing technology, the more competition you have, that drives price down towards our equilibrium. And so we're not, these smaller firearm dealers just don't have the market share to really be able to do that, even though what they're doing may be really innovative and something that larger manufacturers take up later or that government can incentivize the uptake of, et cetera. So right now it's still pretty costly. I would say, though, even, with what the market is doing right now, a sort of larger barrier is that this is not our first rodeo with smart technology. Smart technology actually was introduced for some firearms as early as the mid 90s. Saw another round in the 2014s or so.
And what did that look like in the 90s or 2014? What was smart technology at that point?
So different. It was really different. We didn't have the sort of fingerprint technology that we do now. And so actually, like those firearms, the user wore a watch that paired with the gun. And as you might imagine, we didn't have the Wi-Fi capabilities that we have now either.
Or Bluetooth.
And so firearm users experienced reliability problems, right? The gun didn't pair with the watch really well. And so I think actually sort of getting over some of this reputational reliability of this like old technology, which no one is using anymore. Like that's not what's in the sort of smart gun technology of today. The smart gun technology of today, just like any technology of today, is light years where we were in the mid 1990s. But we're still carrying, I think, some of those reputational concerns about reliability, misfiring, et cetera, that was present in that early round of smart gun technology. And so we have like a couple of barriers. We have to get it to market, we have to get the cost down, and we have to convince firearm owners that this is not making a trade-off with the reliability of their firearm, right? If they needed their firearm in a high-stress situation, that the smart gun technology would not erode their ability to use their firearm in a high-stress situation.
Well, thinking about the expectations for something like this moving forward, if it is rolled out in new firearms, because I think adapting the existing stock of guns probably represents a major challenge. But if it was just to be rolled out in new firearms, what would that mean for gun safety, whether it's police officers and not being shot with their own weapons, or guns being trafficked illegally? I mean, what are the expectations in terms of gun safety?
Yeah, so it's really promising and really exciting for someone, that studies firearm injury prevention. So usually it's looking at like a fingerprint or biometric technology. So the firearm owner would program their fingerprint and then into the weapon. And when the firearm recognizes that biometric fingerprint, then the firearm could be used. And so if a firearm were taken from a law enforcement officer in a struggle or something like that, could not be turned against them because that fingerprint would not be recognized. Similarly, in a home, if a child were to get a firearm, if that fingerprint is not recognized, et cetera. Over, 250,000 firearms are stolen from vehicles every year in this country. If those are stolen, but it doesn't recognize the fingerprint, that firearm is essentially useless to the person who has stolen it. Maybe they can, use the ammo or some parts or something like that, but it's not an operable firearm in any meaningful way. And so really, really promising for that kind of firearm injury prevention. What I do want to just say and sort of caution and put like a caveat around all of this, it's about 60% of firearm deaths in our country are actually from suicide. And so it's not clear to me that this technology would necessarily impact those numbers if the firearms are being used by the authorized user. Certainly, if a child got a hold of a firearm in a home and is not an authorized user, that could, hopefully prevent that kind of firearm suicide. But really, I think firearm safety technology is most promising in reducing sort of our criminal firearm injury and also young children, unintentional shootings, that kind of thing. That's where I see this being the most useful.
Well, what about that existing stock of firearms? And for context, I read on the Trace that more than 500 million firearms have been produced in the U.S. since 1900. So there's a couple guns out there. Is it realistic to think that you could ever adapt all of those guns? And if it's not realistic, is there any point to updating new guns with this technology once it becomes viable?
Sure. Well, 500 million produced, but we don't have that many in circulation. So people do sort of get rid of their firearms either through buybacks or just sort of getting rid of them, or they, when my dad's estate, when my father passed, there were several firearms and we just handed them over to law enforcement. They were not high quality firearms in any, stretch of the imagination. So people do get rid of their firearms in scale. So 500, even though manufactured, is not what we have in circulation.
Sure.
But we have a lot. But like to your point, there's a lot. So there is also technology looking especially at semi-automatic pistols, which are your sort of non-revolver pistols, that can fit onto the firearm and then transform that firearm to being a smart gun that uses fingerprint technology. So it's called, the company that I'm the most aware of is Boss Lock that does this. There could be others, but I think they have a unique product. And it transforms any firearm into being a smart gun that is this pistol. So we could, they range anywhere in cost from $200 to $300. That's expensive for some firearm owners, but it might be worth it. I think for a lot of firearm owners, it is worth it. And so we could do that with the stock. And then, of course, we need to look at other forms of technology, our sort of rifle technology, et cetera, whether or not those can be transformed into being smart guns. But most crimes, and indeed most suicides, are perpetrated by handguns. And so if we could think about making the handgun, stock and flow, both new and old, safer, that would go a long way. There's not going to be one thing that we're going to do, right? Like if we're looking for one silver bullet, pardon the pun, to sort of fix our firearm injury prevention problem in the United States, we're not going to do that. But I do think this is worth exploring and could make a meaningful impact in firearm safety, reducing those injuries in a way that doesn't impede constitutional rights, and also makes firearm owners sort of less subject to crime themselves, either through theft of their firearm, et cetera. And so I think it's promising on a lot of different dimensions.
If we do get to a point where this technology is viable, do you think we should just let the market decide how it's going to be deployed, or does there need to be a government mandate that it is utilized on new guns, and even potentially more controversially, that people with existing guns have to get their guns retrofitted?
I think we need to study the efficacy of it first, right? Like, I think there could be unintended consequences. And one of the things I like about New York's bill that you forwarded me is that it has something to study. I think before we think about like what our policy response should be, we should think about efficacy of these things. And again, this is an emerging market, and we need to think about how to get the market right. I also think there's a middle ground that we can think about between sort of, let the market do it and mandates, which is thinking about government subsidies to incentivize people to do this, right? To allow an element of choice. I do think, though, one of the things that many governments could do is to think about when a firearm is not in use, how to store that firearm. Smart technology is like on the storage continuum. There's a whole lot of things in between. And storage that is biometric and quickly accessible that sort of integrates that sort of moves us along this continuum, I think is actually much more viable and is going to get firearm owners to come along with us in a way that mandates would not. I do think mandating things often creates a lot of resistance even to really good ideas. And we should be thinking about ways to do this with the firearm community as opposed to sort of telling them what's best.
Well, sticking with your work on firearm injury prevention, are there any other sort of technological breakthroughs in the world of guns that you're eyeing that you think can reduce firearm injuries, aside from what we talked about with regards to gun storage or these so-called smart guns with their personalized authorization?
Yes, I think there are two when you touched on, but it's the idea of, I mentioned that a lot of firearms are stolen from vehicles. And I don't think anyone steals a firearm from a vehicle intending to be a responsible gun owner. I think if we're in that situation, like we're at risk of harm being perpetrated with that firearm. And I'm really interested in vehicle secure storage, right? We think about secure storage most often in the home, and that's great. We need to make a lot more progress there as well. But also thinking about how to securely store firearms in vehicles, I think is also really important, both to prevent accidents, but also to prevent theft. And there are so many great new products on the market that I think both make it safer to keep your firearm in your car and reduce likelihood of theft. And that in turn makes all of us safer. I think the other thing, and going to what I mentioned, is that most firearm deaths are actually suicide related. And thinking about integrations of mental health and well-being. So I do some work with an organization called Walk the Talk America as well with BossLock, and they're sort of thinking about like an app that would integrate wellness checks with firearm owners. And that could be a part of your secure storage as well. And so I just think there are a lot of nudges and ways we can think about, firearm injury is an outcome, but there are a lot of steps along the way before we get to firearm injury, and sort of really thinking about how we can use technology to intercept, to delay, to pause, to prevent that outcome from happening. I think there's a lot we can do with technology, especially with apps, especially with nudges, especially with well-being, things that could be integrated with biometric technology, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're totally separate as well.
Well, we've been speaking with Kerri Raissian. She's the executive director of Yale School of Public Health's Firearm Injury Prevention Team and a member of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Kerri, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell & Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.